We are the granddaughters and the grandsons of the witches you weren't able to burn. We are the blood of the witches you thought were dead. We carry witchcraft in our bones, while magic still sings in our heads. When the witch hunters imprisoned our ancestors, when they tried to burn the magic away, someone should have warned them that magic cannot be tamed, because you cannot burn away what has always been aflame.
Now, although there was not much in the way of religious freedom, a lot of groups believed in church reform, with the printing press becoming more accessible to those of non-clergy. People had more access to the Bible. Now, although the Pilgrims and Puritans were of different factions, they both left to come to the colonies in order to be free from persecution as well as practice religious freedom. Now, the Puritans believed that the whole world should conform to God's law, that the purpose of government was to enforce the breaches of God's law, basically punishing people for not following the Bible. The Pilgrims believed in separating from the Church of England entirely, because apparently you were required to attend the Church of England. Not attending the required Church of England was in fact a punishable offense. Now, as I said, yes, the Pilgrims did want to separate from the Church of England entirely, but the Puritans wanted to remain some attachment, and as I said, conform the Church, because they believed that there was too much Catholicism within the Church of England, and they wanted that eradicated. And as in with the Church of England, Puritans wanted people to basically conform to God's law. Now, the Pilgrims, in fact, preceded the Puritans, or came before the Puritans, to the colonies due to the whole issue with religious freedom and religious persecution. And in fact, it was the Puritans who are responsible for the witch trials of Salem, Connecticut, and other states, not the Pilgrims. The Puritans would basically feel that any other religion practiced, if you did not leave immediately, it was in fact punishable by death. There's a story of a woman named Mary Dyer, who was born Puritan, went to England, converted to Quakerism, and then was executed upon her return back to the Puritan colony. Apparently, Puritans had no religious tolerance whatsoever to those who practiced a different religion other than Puritanism. Quakers, for example. This was religious extremism at its finest, but what I find interesting is that both of these groups left due to extremism, but yet they, in fact, more so with the Puritans, ended up performing religious extremism themselves, but yet they talk about breaching God's law, but yet they broke God's law quite often.
1631, the year Massachusetts got its first official laws. Finally, the Puritans wrote down all the things you couldn't do, which was pretty much everything. Massachusetts banned Catholic priests from entering, like literally outlawed priests. Bold move for a group that wanted religious freedom. Oh, and if you weren't a church member, you couldn't vote. Which is ironic, considering everyone came for liberty, just not your liberty. And speaking of liberty, shout out to Roger Williams, who landed in Massachusetts this year and was like, y'all are intense. He'd later found Rhode Island just to get away from them. But for now, he's awkwardly sitting through sermons thinking, I made a mistake. 1631 was a big year for colonial control. The laws were strict, the vibes were tense, and everyone still hated fun. Welcome to 1631, America's earliest HOA meeting, but with muskets. You won't believe what happens next. Like and follow for more U.S. history 1 year at a time. 1628, the year the Puritans said, forget this, we're starting our own country, with blackjack and Bible study. The Massachusetts Bay Company gets a royal charter from the very king they're running away from. Classic, we hate you, but can we borrow your pen? Energy. Enter John Winthrop. Think of him as the motivational speaker of colonial gloom. He writes that whole city upon a hill sermon, aka, we better not mess this up or God's canceling us. Translation: Puritans didn't just want to survive. They wanted to be the blueprint. A starter pack for civilization with extra guilt. Meanwhile in Canada, the French are like, cool story, bro. They're busy mapping rivers, baptizing strangers, and perfecting the fur trade. So yeah, 1628 was less about fireworks, more about foundation building, and passive-aggressive sermons. Next time someone tells you to be a shining example, just remember, the Puritans meant it. Like and follow to find out what happens next.
Today we're talking about the superstitions of the Tudors and how they protected themselves from witches and spirits. Around many Tudor properties you can find daisy wheels or hexafoils. These are typically carved into the original woodwork. You can also find what are known as burn marks. Though initially you might think that these were accidental, they're actually very deep and purposefully made, usually in rooms with lots of windows, doors, or chimneys. Alongside these very obvious protection symbols, you also have those that require a guide and a torch in order to see. These include witches' webs, hidden hexafoils, and concentric circles, which are usually carved into the original woodwork around doors and windows, and some even by fireplaces. These kinds of protection symbols are found in many properties of the time period, but all of these can be found at Little Morton Hall.
Witches have a long and storied history not only here in America, but in England as well. Witch hunting gained popularity in Europe in about 1450. This resulted in an estimated 40,000 executions across Europe. Some of the most famous and talked about events happening in England and colonial America. The witch hysteria hit England hard in 1612, with the educated people of the day convinced that witches were among them. By the time the last English execution took place in 1685, over 500 innocent, mostly women, had been executed. These women were ordinary people who just had knowledge about plants, midwifery, and other such topics. As we know, back then, childbirth was quite treacherous business. But a midwife could easily be charged with witchcraft for letting a child die, even if it was beyond her control. The hysteria did not stay in Europe, however. It hit America hard in 1692.
America was founded basically by a cult, the Puritans. If most people saw them today, they would say that's a cult. This is all something I explore in my new book, Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. First, the Puritans thought doomsday was coming any minute, and this belief dictated most of their daily lives. But more important, they were a high control group, meaning that leadership controlled belief, behavior, and information intake, all with high pressure to conform. Church attendance was mandatory. All transgressions were made public through harsh and humiliating punishments, and dissenters and radicals were kicked out. Over time, church magistrates sought more power, as the leadership of isolated groups always does. They made it harder to gain entry into the church. They did away with the questions and comments sessions following sermons, and they turned residents into informants on one another, especially if you could tattletale on someone for disagreeing with the minister, because also you weren't allowed to disagree with the minister. The effects of high control groups are felt the most by children born into these groups, and scholars who have pored over the diaries of the second and third generations of Puritans in Massachusetts have found during adolescence significant increases in melancholy, psychological abnormalities, nervous breakdowns, suicide, and insanity. Now, the reason we're talking about this is because their doomsday ideology didn't just go away, it went secular and became the foundation of American culture. And not just in that town in Footloose that forbade dancing, but everywhere. The result, I argue, is that Americans are more vulnerable, not just to cult leaders, but also to con artists, salespeople, and politicians who wish to activate us to behave in certain ways, which they do by pushing the buttons of our latent indoctrination. I'm thinking of one off the top of my head who's barred certain journalists from questions and comments following his sermons, who's trying to make it harder to gain entry into our church, and who is arresting people for disagreeing with him. We can only hope he will forbid dancing.
10 fast facts about the Puritans you might not have known. Fact 1, the Puritans didn't dress like this. However, they did dress like this. The Puritans wore a variety of colors, including white, blue, and other subdued earth-toned colors. The Puritans drank alcohol. They didn't view it as sinful, although they did disapprove of excess drinking and public drunkenness. The Puritans didn't refer to themselves as the Puritans. They used terms like the godly and God's children. Unlike other cultures during that time period, Puritan girls were taught to read. This was so they could study the Bible. Puritan men and women were viewed as equals before God. However, when it came to the devil, it was a different story. Women were seen as the weaker sex and therefore more susceptible to Satan's attacks. Unlike earlier migrations to the New World that was typically made up of young men, the Puritans usually came over and settled with their families. The Puritans often get mistaken with the Pilgrims, but they're not the same. The Puritans came to the New World about a decade after the Pilgrims. They also came in much greater numbers and with far more resources. Most Puritan women married in their early 20s and most men married in their mid-20s. The Puritans believed in predestination, which is the belief that God had already determined who would be saved and who would be damned. And lastly, Harvard was founded by the Puritans in 1636, and it was named after Puritan minister John Harvard.
The Puritans thought they were setting up a puritanical utopia when they founded Boston. It was supposed to be the New Jerusalem under their doctrine, the correct one, the only one. So when Anne Hutchinson shows up in 1634 and says, hey, it's not the only one. In fact, it doesn't actually matter what you do in life as long as you have faith in God and it's about your personal relationship with him. That's super dangerous, so they arrest her. And at her trial, they say, what qualifies you to speak about the Lord in the Bible? And she says, well, I hear God speaking to me. That's slightly heretical. She also goes a little antagonistic. It's a good quote, so I'm going to read it to you. She says, you have power over my body, but the Lord Jesus has power over my body and soul. And assure yourselves thus much, if you go on in this course you begin, you will bring a curse upon you and your posterity, and the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it, implying that she's the only one who's right and she hears it from God himself. Yeah, they give her a punishment that is even worse than death. It is cruel to talk about in the 21st century. They banish her to Rhode Island. Moment of silence for Anne Hutchinson.
This is your yearly reminder that the Pilgrims on the Mayflower were not seeking religious freedom. What? A lot of Mayflower passengers were coming for financial reasons, not religious ones. And the handful of Puritans on the boat were definitely not interested in building a society around religious freedom. But I thought the Puritans were like persecuted back in England or whatever. Oh, they for sure wanted to get away from the English church and the way they were doing things. But the Puritans didn't want religious freedom. They wanted to build a strict theocracy with them and their theology at the helm. They had no interest in religious tolerance or freedom for anyone else.
What can you tell me about the Puritans in America?
They went over on the Mayflower. I keep expecting the thing to go off again.
Yeah.
They didn't go on the Mayflower.
No. The great American myth, if you like, is the Puritans arrived on the Mayflower. And they came to avoid religious persecution. In fact, they came in order to be able to persecute.
Yeah, but they hated the Quakers.
What they objected to was the religious freedom in England that meant that you could have all kinds of ranges of religion. Yes, and in 1660, they hanged a woman just for being a Quaker.
Yeah, Mary Dyer.
That's right,
yeah.
The very one. Obviously, many people did come to America to avoid persecution in other lands, but the idea that Puritans came to avoid persecution is they came to persecute. They wanted to build a country in which there could be no dissent from Puritanism.
Let's talk about the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans. I think they're generally grouped into the same category, but they're quite different. So when the Mayflower landed and we think of the first Thanksgiving, we were thinking of Pilgrims. There were about 46 of them, I think, that came on the Mayflower, so very small number, and they thought of themselves as separatists, so they had completely broken away from the Church of England. They wanted to practice Christianity on their own terms. They had gone to the Netherlands before coming to America. But then, and they came in 1620, but then when we think of Puritans, we're talking like Salem witch trial people, okay? So these people, they were a lot better off than the Pilgrims. They came to America in 1630, and whenever they came with 17 ships and over 1,000 people. And the colony grew exponentially for them. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which ended up surrounding and absorbing Plymouth, where the Pilgrims had been. The Pilgrims got along quite well with the Native Americans, and the Puritans did not. They wanted to convert the Native Americans. Just all around wasn't a good time. That is the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans.
If the Puritans wanted religious freedom, then why did they execute a bunch of Quakers? No, they were a cult, and if you disagreed with the leaders, you got kicked out, or worse. Hi, I'm Jane Borden, author of Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. The Quakers were also fond of taking off all their clothes in church. They were activists, basically. They were protesting the theocracy of the Puritans, a Christian nationalism, basically, and the persecution of their own faith. And one of the ways they did it was the practice of going naked, which was designed to point out the hypocrisy of the Puritans, who they said hid beneath the metaphorical dress of authority, status, and wealth. They were also fond of standing up in church at random times and shouting, which is my kind of party. So they weren't allowed. From the jump, the Puritans were like, you can't be here. They kicked them out. But a bunch of them came back, kept coming back. So then the Puritans started cutting off their ears. That wasn't enough of a deterrent. They kept coming back. So the Puritans started killing them. After coming and going several times, this woman, Mary Dyer, was sentenced to the gallows and then dramatically pardoned at the last minute. And a year later, she was back. She was kind of asking for it. Some of these people were martyrs, right? And eventually she got her wish. They left her body hanging from the gallows for a while, in fact, so that anyone looking on could see what happens when you fuck around and find out.
In 1659, a Puritan law passed in Massachusetts. Celebrating Christmas was a crime. Anyone caught feasting, singing, or even saying Merry Christmas faced a fine equal to a week's wages. Why? Puritans believed Christmas was sinful distraction invented by Catholics, full of drunkenness and lies. For over 200 years, Boston stayed silent on December 25th. No carols, no trees, no gifts, just work. In 1856, a visitor wrote, "You'd think it was any other Tuesday." Not a soul smiled. Even after other states embraced Santa and trees, Boston refused. Schools stayed open, shops stayed busy. Christmas only became a legal holiday in Massachusetts in 1856, but true celebration? Not until the 1900s. America's Christmas capital once outlawed joy, and no one remembers why.
Puritan colonists cut off his head and put it on display for 20 years and called it God's justice. 50 years after the first Thanksgiving, after Squanto taught the Pilgrims to plant corn, their grandchildren no longer cared about that kindness. Colonists kept seizing land, forcing English laws, and pushing conversions. The execution of 3 Wampanoag men sparked the bloodiest war in colonial America per capita. When it ended, Wampanoag leader Metacom, known as King Philip, was killed. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 2 decades and his hand sent to Boston as proof of victory. Puritans saw this as a sign of God's favor. After the war, Native men were executed and women and children were enslaved, placed in Puritan homes or shipped to the Caribbean through the Atlantic slave trade. Nearly all Wampanoag land was seized and even Native allies like the Mohegan and Pequot lost land. The belief behind this, that God chooses one people to conquer another, didn't die in the 1600s. You can still hear echoes of it today. Next video, how Puritans justified enslaving survivors.
If you want more stories of women who got put on trial just for speaking their mind, hit follow. Because Anne Hutchinson didn't just challenge the church, she made it tremble. In 1637, in the Puritan stronghold of Massachusetts Bay, Anne Hutchinson was brought to trial. Her crime? She held meetings in her home, teaching scripture and criticizing church leaders. The meetings weren't secret, but they were led by a woman, and that was unacceptable. She taught that people could connect with God directly, that salvation wasn't controlled by ministers, that the colony's leaders were misusing power. They called her a woman not fit for our society. So they put her on trial, grilled her for days, and banished her from the colony, pregnant and in the middle of winter. Anne fled to Rhode Island and later New Netherland. But in 1643, she and most of her children were killed in a raid far from the courtroom that silenced her. Years later, Massachusetts admitted they were wrong, but it was too late. Anne Hutchinson didn't just question authority, she exposed the fear beneath its robe.
The Puritans of New England came seeking freedom to practice their religion without British oppression. Unlike the Pilgrims' austerity, Puritans lived modestly yet embraced business. believing hard work and success reflected God's favor. In Massachusetts, they built a theocracy that required church attendance, moral discipline, and financial support for ministers. Their strict values promoted healthier lives and longer life expectancy, so grandparents became common in New England families. Towns with 50 or more families had to fund schools, ensuring literacy so everyone could read the Bible and follow sermons. Men dominated town meetings and preaching, while ministers often used long sermons to address both scripture and community issues. The meeting house stood at the center of town life, serving as both church and civic hall. Though strict, Puritan life was more complex than stereotypes suggest. Families gathered for barn raisings and communal meals, children played games, and communities celebrated days of Thanksgiving, revealing a society that lived with discipline and devotion, yet remained unexpectedly vibrant.
Rowley, Massachusetts, winter of 1648. The marsh froze and the meeting house lanterns guttered. They called it the Covenant of Pine Ground. 12 men signed under a black beeswax seal. A child held the quill, eyes milk pale, silent. Reverend Shepherd preached, voice thin as reed wind. Witnesses listed tides, comets, and due chastisements. They promised purity or God would harvest heirs. The ledger vanished after the Cambridge Platform Synod. In 1926, Eleanor Shaw found it beneath Rowley. Cellar bricks hid a chest wrapped in sailcloth. Pages smelled of brine, iron, and winter smoke. Fingerprints in soot circled the wax, small and ringless. Margins bore initials, CW, JC, and IM. Names matched baptism rolls, then coastal drownings followed. Plum Island, 1662. 2 boys found beneath ice. Ipswich Neck, 1692. A widow walked into waves. Town records marked each loss as providential warning. State men arrived masked, citing mold and secrecy. They photographed everything, then marked the box withdrawn. Shaw kept one rubbing, the seal pressed 3 times. A note in Latin repeated, Pactum renovator per stirpes. The witness column bore a crossed-out 13th name. The final page leaves tonight's date cold and blank.